today for another edition of Solarity Live. I think this is going to be close to the end. I think at the end of June, just so everybody knows, we're going to wrap this discussion about Solarity Live, and we'll probably move into a little bit different cadence for having a conversation and maybe restructure it around some different things. But today, we get a chance to talk with two guys that I work with directly, and I've learned a lot from, and they're two of my good friends, and so I'm excited about having them here. And this is a very important conversation, and that has to do with cybersecurity and what's going on with all the changes that are going on for businesses. There are a lot of the same threats that are out there, and there are a few different threats that have popped up, and we'll talk through those today. We'll talk about some vigilance that you can have as you're working remotely, and as folks are working remotely for you in the community. But we'll cover what's the same, what has changed, and what role can you play in cybersecurity. So Wes Allen is a senior information security engineer, and he's now, he and Don Garrison, who's a security engineer, have joined the Solarity team, so I'm excited about that. And we'll go on. Our conversation continues to be around transforming the model that we used to work, and today we're going to get to apply a different level of security, or think about how we can apply the right level of security as we adapt our processes and move to this new normal. We've also been talking about a roadmap forward, and one of the things that has to be on our roadmap is we have to understand what the threats are, what the dangers are, put up our guardrails so that we can stay safe as we have to take action to move forward and transition to operations as we go into this new normal. And so security is a prime part of that, and that's what we're going to get to talk about today. So Wes and Don, I'm going to turn it over to you, let you introduce yourselves, and we're going to begin to talk about what has changed.
Wes Allen, IT for 27-ish years now, focused on security, mostly public sector for the last 7 or 8. Try to help people make things a little bit safer. You can't take away all the risk, but you can do some things to mitigate it. So we'll try to go over a few of those things today.
Yeah, and I'm Don Garrison. Been in IT in Central Kentucky for a good number of years. 16 comes to mind, but that's more the professional years. More focused on security the last few, and joined Wes in the public sector about 2 years ago. So go for it, Wes.
So I don't have control of the slide deck, right? You do, Bert?
No, I do.
Okay. So yeah, today we're going to talk a little bit about things that are different. So one of the things that hasn't changed, though, is you still have the same assets, right? You still have the same data. You still have the same people that want to compromise your data, that want to sell your data, that want to hit you with ransomware. All that stuff has changed, is the same. So that hasn't really changed. So those things are still constant. The thing that has changed, though, is how people are accessing that information, right? So instead of being on your workstation at work, a lot of people are working remotely now. So that sort of changes where you can apply controls, where you can apply some security, and the kind of security that you need to have. So today we're going to talk a little bit about those two things. The human layer, the people, how you interact with your data, how you interact with your accounts, and also on the endpoint. Because again, that's one of the things that's changed. You no longer have a corporate governed PC potentially, right? You could be working from home, from your personal machine, from a phone a lot more maybe. So those are the things that have kind of changed, and that sort of changes your security posture around a little bit. So that's kind of what we're going to go over today.
Great. Wes and Don, this always makes me think about the fact that, these are layers of security, right? And whenever I hear about layers, I think about ogres and onions. And we all have layers, and we have to get through this. And that's one of the things is, I'm not sure how familiar people are, depending on where you sit in the organization, the difference between the layer of the human being out front and your mission critical assets that are right at the center of the organization. So it's really fascinating as we begin to talk about this. Just as a reminder, as we go through here, we're going to be talking, we could be using some language that you're not familiar with. We do have the questions and the chat area where you can get in there and ask any questions for clarification. So please use that. Cole and I will be staying on top of that. So we really want to focus in though on what role you can play. So I'm going to turn this back over to Wes and Dawn and talk about some of these layers here and how things go. And I think we can move on from there.
Yeah, so here's a list of some of those things that we can work on, right? Password best practices, making sure that we use a password manager. And the reason we do that is so that we can have a unique password for every account. Password reuse is a very popular way for attackers to compromise an organization. Say you have the same password for your email and your corporate account as you do for a web forum somewhere. That web forum gets hacked, the attackers dump those passwords, and then they take those same passwords along with those email accounts and start spraying them out to other websites to see which ones they can get into. So that's a fairly common thing, and using a password manager makes it a lot easier to track and maintain a separate strong password for every single account, or at least most accounts, right? And then you secure that password manager with a very strong 16, 20 character passphrase, which will keep it safe. So that's that thing. There's a little bit of that, all your eggs in one basket risk, but that is lower than reusing passwords across different sites. So that's kind of one of our big recommendations is definitely to try to use a password manager. Not all enterprises have jumped on board with that yet, so that's something you need to work out with your IT team. But for personal use, or if you're a smaller org, then definitely look into a password manager. And so good password managers. I'm a big fan of 1Password. The number one with password, they have a Teams version of it for small orgs. They have a family version of it as well. Their blog has a lot of great information, so that's the one I put out there. LastPass is pretty good. KeepPass is another one. There's a few out there that are pretty good, but again, I'm a big 1Password fan. And then multi-factor authentication. So that's another really important control. So if your password does get compromised, whether either via password reuse or if you get phished or someone guesses your password, if you have multi-factor enabled, they can't do anything with that password. So that really is a very strong security measure. It makes it, there's ways around it, and then there's some that are a little bit stronger than others, but anytime you can use multi-factor, you definitely want to try to do that. If you combine multi-factor with strong passwords via password manager, that's going to take a lot of the attack surface away from the people that want to harm your data or steal your data or anything like that.
Yeah, MFA is used on lots of social media accounts as well. So if you've got O365 for your email, or you've got the G Suite if you use the Google apps, you certainly want to look into using multi-factor authentication to better secure your account.
And phishing. So phishing is the number one initial hook for a very large percent of attacks and compromises. So the tricky thing with phishing, though, is that you have to interact with people over the internet via email, right? I mean, there are people, it's easy to say, hey, don't click the link. Hey, don't open that document. But if your job is to click the link or to open the document, then you have to try to be a little bit more aware of the context around that email, right? So evaluate the sender, make sure it makes sense. If you normally never receive DHL packing shipping notifications and you all of a sudden get one, then maybe that's a sign that that's not a legit thing, right? If you are soliciting resumes, though, maybe you do get doc files. I mean, maybe that could be something that's common for you to get. So you have to kind of do a little bit of filtering just at a high level to understand what should be coming in versus what is coming in. And then when you do receive those, you can be very careful with things like macros. There's ways inside of Office to disable macros from the internet. Because that's a very common initial step for an attacker. They'll send you a Word document with a macro. You open it, It's going to pop the screen that says, hey, you've got to enable the macros to see the content. When you click that link, then that allows them to go out and pull down some malware and begin the process of compromising you. So that's a big one. Just be careful with the macros. Links, again, same thing. There are times when you have to click it. People send out links all the time in emails. It's important to be able to use that method of communication, but at the same time, you have to do a little bit of validation on that, right? Does that make sense? Hover over the link to see if it goes someplace where you expect it to go. And then, yeah, just kind of being careful with it, even though you do have to sometimes click those links. If it's something coming in from a purported, like one of your accounts, like, hey, here's my bank sending me an email to log in. Instead of clicking the link, though, you can go to your bank website directly and then log in that way. That's another easy way to sort of bypass the phishing, is to go to those links directly in a web browser versus clicking on it. So again, that's another one of those things that just takes some awareness and takes context around what you're doing, right? If you take your time and slow down, a lot of times you'll realize that, wait, that doesn't really make sense for me to get that email, or why is he sending me that email? And if you're ever in doubt, always use something on a band, right? Call up the person. Hey, if your boss sends you an email that says check this link, and he doesn't usually do that, just send him a text. Give him a call, walk across the hall, and just sort of check what's next, right? See if he really did, or see if they meant to do that. And that's one of the ways where working remote is a little bit different, because you can't just pop across the hall now, right? So now it's more like you check with a chat app or with a phone, or just sort of use an out-of-band verification. That also will short circuit a lot of business email compromises and things like that. So if your boss never asks you to send him $300 worth of iTunes cards, rather than replying to the email asking him about it, pick up the phone and call. Use a text app. If you use Teams, anything like that, just out of band from where you receive that request, is a good way to short circuit all those kinds of attacks.
It's pretty common that the email that you receive includes I'm in the middle of a meeting type scenario, to kind of thwart that whole out of band communication. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But know that it's pretty common for emails to come in specifically for gift cards to give to very important people, but the person requesting is kind of out of pocket. So that's the way that they play those emails.
And that's that same next point too, right? So if you're not expecting an invoice from a company that you've never dealt with, maybe it's not a legit email, right? Maybe it's not a legit invoice. If you are expecting it, then maybe verify it with the company if you're not 100% sure. But again, those things are common in business. So that's one of the reasons why it's very successful, is that you have to do business, right? You can't just not click the link. You can't just not open up an invoice if that's your job. So the key is trying to do that safely by maintaining that context. And kind of that sort of falls in the next, is the patch your operating system and patch your applications. If you keep current versions of Office and you keep current versions of Windows, there's less of a chance of things going further if you do open up one of those documents that is malicious, right? If you open a document and you don't enable macros, and you have the newest versions of Windows 10 and the newest versions of Office, the odds of anything bad happening are much less. If you're still running Office 2010 and you're on Windows 7 and you open that same document, there's a much greater chance of it going further, right? So that's one of the things you can just about chart out a graph that the newer something is, the more secure it is. It's not 100%, but generally speaking, especially with Microsoft products or Google products, the newer it is, the better the security is. So keeping things updated, trying to use the newest versions where you can, and keeping it patched will help mitigate a lot of those things, right? It's all about some defense in depth. Like, yeah, you're going to try to stay aware of the links that you click or the documents that you open. If a document gets through that, you're not 100% sure of when you open it, if your apps are updated and you're running the newest versions of things, the odds of it going further are less. So again, it's all about sort of stacking some defenses in place so that, even if things don't go perfectly, you still end up okay.
Yeah, a key part to patching, Microsoft specifically releases patches on Patch Tuesday, and there's a known follow-up called Compromise Wednesday, where they, if you're not relatively quick with applying those patches, you could potentially see a vulnerability surface as a result of that patch being released, where they kind of work their way back towards what the vulnerability is. So it's another reason to keep pretty up to date on specifically OS patches.
The next one, use native apps where possible. So one thing that we see a decent amount of is you have a need to watch a video or to open a PDF, and you don't necessarily have the app that you think you need on your workstation. So you got to Google and you say, hey, I need a PDF reader. And there shows, 10, 20, 30 different ones. You click the first link and it downloads a piece of software and you install it. And then that software maybe has some adware, maybe it's some spyware, or maybe it's just outright malicious. So avoiding downloading executable files and use native tools. So for PDFs, Internet Explorer or Chrome, you can view PDFs just fine. And that's kind of that idea is you don't want to trust random downloads from the internet. You want to try to stay with first-party apps. So as an example of a text editor, a lot of people like a program called Notepad++ or Sublime Text, and those are great editors. But now I'm exposing myself to some supply chain issues if the people that produce that software aren't super careful. But if I use VS Code, which is a Microsoft product, then I already trust Microsoft. I already kind of have to trust Microsoft. So I've not really increased my attack surface very much. So that's the idea behind that, is to try to use native apps where possible. Use Microsoft, use Google, use Adobe, use those top tier people when you can, and avoid going out to try to find a shareware software to do this or that or the other thing. You'll find most functions that you need can be handled by the host OS now, right? Back in the Windows 7 days, maybe you need to download a CD burner software. Now you can do that inside of Windows. So those are the kind of things that we try to bring people's attention, that you might have a native tool already for that, and you don't necessarily need to go and download an app and increase your risk for that.
Yeah.
Personal devices to access corporate data. So this is the tricky part. This is where a lot of the work from home stuff starts. If you were at work and you had a desktop, it's not super easy for you to pick that up and bring it home with you and set it up and use it, right? So you're seeing a lot of people using personal devices to access their corporate data. And that's where you run into some issues with security. Maybe your enterprise has a very strict image on what they can run. They have monitoring in place. They have tools in place to watch that desktop. And now you're accessing that same data that we were protecting before from your personal machine. So that opens up some security issues, because maybe your personal machine is not as secure as your work machine. And maybe it's more secure, right? I mean, it sort of depends on your IT department and your security department. So when possible, try not to use your personal devices. And if you do, maybe set aside a specific personal device to use for work and then not use it for anything else. Don't know what known issue with audio. Is my audio having trouble, or?
I don't think so, because I'm hearing you fine, Wes.
I hear you fine.
Yep.
The
The other thing about, setting aside a personal device, Wes, is just not having your kids download the newest Flash game that they want to play on there, because a lot of those games come with extraneous, if not nefarious, code that can compromise or provide access into networks too.
Right, and this is not it's happened multiple times, and I've been involved actually with a couple of incidents where a user accessed corporate data from a home machine where the home machine was compromised, and that was then the attacker's way into the corporate network, right? So it ended up being some breach notification stuff. So, it is important to keep in mind that the data is what the attackers are after, not necessarily your workstation. And wherever you access that data, you should be cognizant of the security of that device. iPhones in general, iPads, the newest Android devices with the newest version of Android are all decent at security. When you start getting into Windows, if you start getting into older versions of Windows or machines that you've had sitting around for 2 or 3 or 4 years that a bunch of different people have used, you don't really have as much control over them. You don't really understand the baseline security. So those, it's important to maybe not use those to access your corporate data. And if you do need to, maybe do a fresh install of Windows. Maybe pull out one of your older machines and do a fresh install of Windows 10 on it, and use that for your dedicated work machine, even though it's your personal machine. So just trying to keep that footprint as low as you can for access to that corporate data. All those kind of personal devices at home can be useful, right? Like if you get a little firewall, Sonic Wall, or one of the smaller Palos, or PSense, or any of that kind of stuff. Those are all good things to have, but depending on how you're accessing that information, it may not provide a large amount of additional protection, right?
If you think about, if you think about the network from 15 years ago, the objective was to put up a strong firewall, and that protected everything beyond it. So that's no longer the area that they're targeting. The entry point for much of the malice is specifically email, and we'll get to that here in the next slide or so. A revisit to that phishing, but yeah, so they're targeting you as they know that you need to receive and respond to open and click emails, and so that's the direction that they're going, and they've been successful at, as opposed to putting up something that's a hardened firewall. Not to say that it's not important, but it doesn't give you the same level of security as it once did.
Right.
I don't know if that's where you're with that.
And I got a question about the tools for scanning for viruses and malware, and I'll go ahead and wrap 2 things into this. I'm a big fan of Windows Defender. It's built in, it's free. They do a really good job with it. It has a very low resource utilization, and it typically causes less problems than a third-party antivirus agent. So Windows 10 and newer, Windows Defender, make sure you've got your updates turned on and it's good to go. And kind of to wrap into thinking about the firewall, one of the things that you can do is to subscribe to something like OpenDNS, or what's the one that Cisco bought? There's services out there that you redirect your DNS to, right? So instead of allowing your DNS to go out to the internet in general, you run it through a filtering service, and they filter out some of the malware. And you can do that without having to have a firewall or any kind of advanced appliance in your house. You simply change your DNS settings from the ones your ISP gives you to this service, and then this service you can then configure to filter some malware. And that's a real inexpensive way to do that. Usually there's a monthly charge, but they do a really good job keeping things up to date. It's basically like URL filtering, right? So if you use Windows Defender and you have a service like, I can't remember the name of that. Anyways, there's some services out there. Yeah, Google, I don't know that they filter anything themselves directly, but there are some ones that out there that do. And that's one of the things that you can look into. Is kind of an inexpensive way to get you some filtering at your house without buying a full-on firewall. And I'll try to find one of those and dump it into the notes or something like that if I can remember it.
And it's always important too to remember that these conversations are best if you're working in an organization. Go ahead and ask your IT team, ask your security team what they recommend, because some of these can actually block traffic back and forth inadvertently because of some default settings. So you want to make sure that your internal team knows what's going on. All of these are great products, but if it doesn't work with your enterprise, then it's fine. It's fine, but it's not of a great value.
Wes, are you talking about Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1 or their new?
No, there's another one. I can't. It was one of my Cisco bought them not too long ago, and I stopped recommending it, but I think they're still pretty good. Cisco buys everything, right, these days. So I want to say it's OpenDNS, but I can't remember for sure if that's what it is. But anyways, so that's another way to do that, right? So rather than spending money on buying a commercial antivirus product, your money is better spent using a DNS filtering service. That'll get some of those URLs and it'll get some of that bad malware. And the last point is to protect your processes. So one of the things that is very important, and we see this this attack being successful, you get an email asking you to create an invoice or create a check or fill a PO or transfer some money to somebody, and you arrange that whole transaction electronically, right? All over the same email channel. So what you want to do is for any of those kind of critical processes, you want to have an out-of-band way to verify those, right? So you shouldn't be able to initiate a bank transfer without an in-person or an over-the-phone conversation. And that's a secondary control. So you can't add a new vendor without having a different kind of process. So what you want to do is build some non-technical controls into your processes so that even if your email is compromised, that transaction won't go through because there's a step that's outside of the email that has to be verified, right? So, before I can wire $10,000 to a new company, I have to actually talk to our controller or to our CFO or CIO or something like that before it happens. And that'll also stop a lot of those business email compromises, because occasionally the attackers will actually get the person's real email, right? They will compromise that person's email and it will be like it's coming from that person. It is their email account. They will, they actually study the people and they watch their mannerisms. They watch the words they use. They know their schedules. And so it really looks like it's coming from your CEO that says, hey, I need you to wire new money to a new account. If you have a process that goes outside of email to verify that, that's how you can protect yourself. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about non-technical controls over your processes.
Yeah, maybe you want to implement those or set a threshold at which you want to add that additional step. So if it's $50, you're not too concerned about it. But if it's 100,000, you kind of get a little bit. You want that extra assurance.
Good. So one of the things we talked about in getting ready for this presentation, guys, is walking through some, a standard exploit like a phish. And what are there, because I think a lot of people hear this information, but they're not necessarily familiar with what goes on and why it offers so much vulnerability and so much danger and threat to an organization. So if we can kind of talk through the steps of a phishing hack.
Yeah, so we'll be working left to right on this. And so obviously the email is sent from some place, whether it's a compromised account like Wes just mentioned, or it's something that is a impersonation account where they're attempting to be someone who's has an existing relationship or is just an email out of the blue. Email enters your system. Normally the first step is that it goes through an email security gateway of some sort. Once it is verified because it doesn't match a particular signature of existing known malware, which happens quite often. It's then sent to your email server and then ultimately to your inbox. And that's the point at which, I kind of want to focus on this particular slide is what does the end user have the opportunity to do, and how is that end user impacted by this? So end user sees a new email from someone, they have the opportunity to review the sender, all those things that we talked about on that last slide. Review the sender. Is this someone that I know? Is this an organization that I interact with? Is this something that they would typically ask of me or send to me? Those are all good sanity checks to have. But let's say it is an organization you're familiar with, you open up a message, and unfortunately it's malicious. Well, the normal first step is just a very small application that kind of sidesteps the antivirus up until that point, because they know that your security is set up to try to prevent a malicious email from making its way to your inbox. So you open up this message. It's got a Word doc in it. Let's say you enable macros because it says, oh, you can't see the content, which is a common approach. Oh, you can't see the content. Make sure and enable macros, and that'll let you see the super secret information I want to let you know about. Once you do that, a couple of different things happen in the background. You don't see it. You may see content displayed on the screen, but in general, what's really going on is something's going on in the background. Many cases, that's doing what's called a stage 2 download. It's actually picking up a more malicious, more full-featured piece of malware, downloading it and executing it on your computer. And again, the antivirus of the traditional antivirus is really there to identify known malware that has a particular profile and matches a particular specific what's called a hash. So if you change a file, even by capitalizing one of the letters that's in it, and you rehash that file, that hash is what's used to compare against a database to identify it as malicious or benign. And it's very easy to sidestep that signature-based validation. So stage 1, small file. Stage 2, more comprehensive file. It actually gets executed, whether that means that ransomware is now on your computer, they're doing some level of data exfiltration, or they see that they're within the confines of a corporate network, and now all of a sudden they can move from your computer into maybe another computer, or potentially up the stack into a server that you have on your corporate network. That's what they're looking for. Normally, the point that is compromised, the endpoint that's compromised, isn't really the target. Normally, it's something else. And one of those things that happens at the very end is persistence. So what that means is the ability for that malicious attacker to revisit the compromised computer at their schedule whenever they want, because now all of a sudden they have something that is doing what they call command and control, or does an initiated connection from the compromised computer back out to the malicious actor, so that the malicious actor can then interact with that computer again. So that's kind of the run through. Wes, do you have any addition to that?
No, I mean, that's basically it. So you see you have some potential places where you can stop that chain, right? They call it the kill chain, but there's a few places where you can defend against this. So if you are using O365 and you pay extra per month, you get additional security at your gateway. So Microsoft for O365, they will filter some emails, right? There are some obvious malicious stuff that they filter. If you pay a little bit extra, you get a little bit more protection. If you pay a little bit extra more, you get even more protection. So that's a place where you can stop things. The malicious foothold he's talking about, if we have our macros disabled on our Office, right? So that's going to stop it there. If we have Defender and the signatures are updated, and we have pretty good odds of catching that second stage that way, right? So those are some places where you can kind of stop that chain. And if you break it anywhere, you've done your job and you broke it the whole way through. So that's kind of when we talk about defense in depth. You've got a chain of things that are going to go on, and you want to try to break one of those links. And if you do, then you've stopped the ransomware or the data exfil. So that's why it's important to kind of have those things that are in depth, right? But again, it's not always free. If you're using O365, if you want to go to the E5, that's a big step up. If you want to just get the add-on, then again, it's a little bit smaller step. Google, I'm not sure if they offer an additional paid tier or not, but there are multiple companies out there that will filter your email before it gets to Google, or before it gets to Microsoft, or before it gets to your corporate Exchange server for a fee. And then again, those can be that can be expensive, but it can also be money well spent, because this is the number one way that people are getting compromised these days. So yeah, just try to think of those ways that you can break that chain anywhere before they get to where what they want, right? Which is running the ransomware or stealing your data. So, good email gateway security, disable those macros, keep your Office up to date, and keep Defender up to date. And again, there's another one at that stage. If you want to spend more money, you can go into an advanced antivirus, right? So Microsoft has Defender ATP, right? Advanced Threat Protection. You got Carbon Black. You've got a bunch of other ones out there that, again, they're not cheap and they have a lot of overhead to run them, but they do give you additional protections. So that helps stop some of that stuff before it gets to where it's compromised.
Yeah, one of the things that we wanted to talk about, though, is, and I've had this happen in a couple of customers and clients that we've worked with, and that is that they heard these words, they heard phishing, they heard ransomware, but they just didn't understand the anatomy of what was happening and really why it was important that they stopped it. So it's important that if somebody's sending out an email saying, hey, listen, watch out for this particular threat, and you don't know what that is, ask your security team about it. It's okay not to know all these new things. It's not everybody's job to. Securing the enterprise is really a cooperative effort. And if they don't understand that you don't understand, it's hard for you all to work together. And so that is just the one thing too that I've learned over the years, is making sure that when people just throw around terms, we do it in project management, some people do it, in engineering, you throw around these terms and not everybody's familiar with them. So you have to stop and ask them, okay, what does that mean? What does that acronym mean? What is a phishing email? So that's what we're really hoping that people take away from this, is it's okay to ask.
I would add on to that. Sorry to interrupt. I would add on to that, just saying your IT team is going to be more happy with the situation if you ask the question and it's something that is malicious, and you stop it before it executes, as opposed to waiting until after the fact and saying, oh darn, I knew something didn't feel right, but I went ahead and launched it or opened it anyway. They'd rather have that 5-minute conversation via an email, forwarding the email on to IT staff or whatever the process is that you've adopted. That's going to be far better than going through and the incident response process of potentially revamping that entire, or reinstalling everything that's on that computer.
All right, so as we wrap up, what are the things that people need to take away and to remember from what we've talked about today, guys?
Yeah, so if you've been around information security or IT, a lot of people talk about perimeters, right? That's where you have your firewalls. It's kind of the old castle moat sort of model. Anything inside my organization is safe. Anything outside is danger. But that model hasn't been valid for a while now, although people are still trying to catch up to that. So you want to think more about endpoints and data when you're talking about protecting things. So you protect your endpoints, that's your laptops and your smartphones, with keeping them up to date, keeping them patched, using third-party tools if you need to. You protect your data by protecting your user accounts, because remember, your user account is how you access that data. So if your user account is compromised, your data can then be compromised. So that's using MFA, that's using password managers, making sure everything's encrypted, making sure that you're aware of phishing and what it is and how to prevent it. And then, assuming all the technical controls fail, you want to have non-technical controls to kind of cover you in case that happens, right? Especially for financial transactions. If you work with your accounting team, your financial team, they have processes in place to help protect that. A lot of places that we work with, they have 2 or 3 checks that are non-technical that have to go through before certain things happen. So those are really important, and that can really save a big loss, right? By just picking up the phone and calling someone directly versus replying to an email. That's always a good, quick way to find out for sure what's going on.
That's separation of duties. That's 2 signatures on a check. That's, all that sort of stuff.
Good. And really the goal here is that we protect the assets that we're responsible for in the organization, and we kind of move forward. So we're to that time in the conversation where we get to have some Q&A. So we've had some good questions so far. Anybody else want to
So
get in here?
there's one right now that's the Internet Backbone Router scan for known viruses. No, they do some things with some botnets, but very little. Most of the Internet Backbone stuff is very neutral as far as the traffic, right? They don't do a lot of inspection of it. The other thing you run into is a decent amount of this malicious traffic is encrypted now, right? So as it passes that Internet backbone, it's encrypted and they wouldn't know what it is anyways. So if it's coming down over SSL, or if I'm using secure email or any of those types of things, they wouldn't even be able to see that it's malicious anyway. So it's just kind of one of those problems where, yeah, if they were controlling it a little bit more centrally, maybe it would work a little bit better. But in general, no, they're not really doing anything at that level. Now, I will say that organizations, especially Microsoft, have taken a very proactive approach into researching the threats and researching the attackers, and then filing lawsuits to get server seized, to get domains seized. And so you're seeing some of that pushback. Google maintains a Project Zero where they try to work on exploits and try to understand what's going on and try to get patches. So there is some work happening with some of those vendors, but generally not at the traffic level. They try to be very, very neutral with that. And that's kind of what that I just said, right? So there are a lot of forensics companies out there and IR companies out there that, should some malware happen or should an attack happen, they can trace it back to an extent. The problem with attribution, though, is it is very tricky, right? So, for instance, if I'm an attacker, I probably am not attacking you from my house. I'm going to use a compromised server somewhere else. I'm going to use some other organization's hardware, and so I can attribute it back to that server, but then I have no idea where to go from there. And so that server is in Russia, or that server is in China, or that server is an AWS instance that's running out of Virginia. I mean, I can only trace it back to there, and it's hard to go back further. There are some ways, if you look, there are some companies out there that track what they call advanced persistence threats, APTs. And so they track them by their tactics and by their targets and by some of the code that they use. And they can try to track it from one campaign to another, based on those things. So there is a decent amount of stuff out there. The problem, though, is when you say alert proper authorities, if they're located in a country that doesn't really care, then nothing's going to happen, right? So that attribution, actually bringing people to justice, is fairly rare. It happens occasionally, but not very often. And so, go ahead.
And if you go to the nth degree, right, these are nation state actors, right? So these are, in fact, outside countries that are initiating some of this malicious attack.
What many people don't know is that the U.S. Secret Service actually has a whole office called Nitro that works on this. And if you have been exposed to a wire fraud, that's mainly the ones that they get involved with. So it's if it's been within 48 hours of the attack, if it's over, I forget what the amount is, but over a certain amount, and it is set to go internationally, they can actually get involved for free and help your company out. So it's better to actually contact the right authorities. And if your folks are not having those conversations, it's good to reach out to the Nitro office. I know Lexington has one. I believe there's one in Frankfurt and Louisville as well. They have Nitro officers that they can basically put boots on the ground as soon as something happens. When that's there, and call in people from surrounding areas. So that's always something to keep involved. Getting the authorities involved, especially at that level, can help out, but there are some criteria around that as well.
And so there was another one about informing at all levels of the organization. I think that a lot of that depends on your corporate culture and the size of your organization. A bigger organization, if they have a defined security practice, right, defined security education practice, that's usually a good way to do it. A lot of places, the CISO is not necessarily with IT department. They're under finance, or they're under a different, or they're equal to the other C-level executives. So it really is a corporate culture kind of thing. And then, there's ways to push it top down. There's ways to push it bottom up, right? It's just it really is very organization specific. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't find security until after something happens, right? The number of people that buy alarms after the house is broken into is pretty high compared to the people that buy alarms before they're broken into. And that's kind of that same way with a lot of IT security stuff. There's never money for security until you're compromised, and all of a sudden there is some money, right? So it's just one of those things where it's really an organizational thing where you have to, your leadership has to be on board, has to understand the risk, and be willing to dedicate some resources, but you also need some people kind of pushing from the bottom up to get it done too. So ransomware, yeah. So depending on the ransomware strain, once it happens, the data, if the attacker is competent, the data is gone, right? There is no way to unencrypt it without paying. There have been a few ransomware, malware pieces of software out there that have had flaws, that have had mistakes where people were able to recover those keys and then recover the data, but that's pretty rare. So basically your defense against a ransomware is to have really good backups that are offsite and offline. And that's the key, right? So if I'm protecting some data, I don't want to have that just tied to a USB drive that's attached to my computer. I want to have 2 or 3 USB drives where I make a backup on Monday, I take that drive home with me. Then Wednesday, I make another backup on the second drive. I take that home with me. And then on Friday, I bring the first drive back in again and rotate. So, but you have something that's always offsite and offline. And that's pretty key to recover. The only real way to be assured of recovering is to wipe everything. That's servers, that's all email servers, that's all workstations, everything. Build it from scratch and then restore from a known good backup. So a ransomware can be a pretty devastating attack for a lot of places if you're going to try to recover it correctly. If you have Microsoft Active Directory, places recommend like wiping AD and starting over again. So you have to recreate all your user accounts, all your permissions, all that stuff. So it's a big deal.
From time to time, though, FBI does seize key servers, and so you can't. There are every once in a while there's a story where those boxes are made, those keys are then made available to unencrypt that data. But that's again far and few between.
So the Iron Key thumb drives, I believe those were encrypted USB drives, and those are pretty good. Today, we can do that same thing with BitLocker, which is included in all Windows now. So if you have USB keys, you can encrypt that with it's a good practice to encrypt your data, right? So say you have some super important files, and you want to protect them, you want to back them up to a USB drive. If you use BitLocker to encrypt that drive, then you have a good backup, and if that USB drive is lost, no one can recover that data, assuming you use a solid password, right? If you use password 123 to encrypt the data, then maybe it's not as safe as if you use a good 20-character passphrase to protect it. But yeah, I think I had one of those at one time, actually, an Iron Key. But now you can do it with just any USB drive in BitLocker.
Yeah, that was also one of those that if you cracked the case on it, it broke, intentionally, physically broke the device itself. But the real question, a follow-up question to that might be, why are you using a thumb drive to begin with, right? If you're sharing data externally, why would you be using a thumb drive if you're moving data from computer A to computer B? Why wouldn't you just use OneDrive or your Google Drive?
And I would say that the answer to that question would be file level encryption, right? So if I have file level encryption on a USB drive, then it's protected even if my Google account gets compromised or my Microsoft account gets compromised. And I use them for backup. A lot of people will use those for backups too, right? So I can use a USB thumb drive or a USB drive to back up and rotate stuff off-site. So using that in combination with BitLocker is a reasonable way to back up and secure your data. So one of the things that you see with Macs versus PCs is there are actually a decent number of attacks on Mac. They don't tend to be published as much. it's more of a market share issue than anything. There's, especially in the corporate environment, most of the machines are Windows, and so attackers go where the money is, right? And so that's the way to make some money. I will say, one of the things that people don't maybe realize, and until you've seen it happen in person, for an advanced attacker, Macs are in a lot of ways easier than Windows 10, simply because of some of the tools that they have built in, like Python, like Bash. They don't have the advanced protections that Windows 10 can have. So for Windows 10 Enterprise, implemented properly, is incredibly secure. Joining it to a domain is usually where you run into problems, because once it's in a domain, that's kind of the weak link. But a Windows 10 Enterprise machine secured appropriately is pretty secure. Macs, kind of out of the box, are a little bit better than the average Windows machine, but they don't have the advanced protections that you can get into with Windows if you have someone that understands it and that can configure it correctly. But most of it's market share right now, at least.
So I think our last question today, guys, has to do with maybe a proactive stance on security, and it's being asked by Carl, and maybe implementing blockchain or other distributed ledger technologies to actually protect data at different ways so that it's not as open to be thwarted at some place along the process. You want to speak to that, or any ideas, thoughts?
I mean, distributed ledgers have a place, I think, for some stuff, but from what I've seen, it's more in generating VC money, right? There's not too many practical on-the-ground solutions that do much with it. I mean, I can talk about next-gen, next-level AI, blockchain, and someone will give me $1 million. But how do you actually turn that into a product that helps people secure data? I think is still a little bit far away, especially when there's pretty well proven technologies already that are out there you can actually use. Again,
I muted Wes for a minute because he's having some trouble with the dogs at the house. The beauty of working at home. We should have given out the. We should have actually given out the bingo card, because that would have probably made bingo for a couple people as we do this. Well, I want to thank Don and Wes. Wes, I put you on mute just to cover stuff up.
I'm unmuted now.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. My dogs don't like the mailman.
Well, very few do. Want to thank you all for being willing to do this. Again, it's my privilege to have worked with you over the years. I think I've worked with Wes since 2016 and Don for about 1.5 years here. So I've learned a lot from them. They make me a better professional, and we wanted to share that competency with you all. I hope this was a very good presentation. And valuable to you. I'd invite you to join us next week on the 18th for our next to last presentation. So we will we'll have the schedule up soon. We're making the final preparations for who will be involved in that. And then I think the last one may be a review of the things that we've talked about and kind of bringing the conversation to a close for the moment. And then we can open up the conversation as needed or redirect the conversation as helpful to the community. Thank you all again for spending time with us today. It's our privilege of hosting you, and I hope you have a good week and that you're all well during this time. Take care.